And a warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. Tonight we thought of talking to two female parliamentarians representing the Women's Parliamentarians Caucus in Parliament to discuss the government's role in Sri Lanka's economic revival, as well as the opposition's role in ensuring that the government takes the necessary decisions and policy reforms to ensure that Sri Lanka has a sustainable economic revival. I've invited to our studios, representing the opposition, Dr Harini Amarasuriya of the NPP, led by the Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna. A warm welcome to you. And also we have with us Minister Diana Gamage, representing the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna-led government. And we have both representatives of the Women's Parliamentarians Caucus here tonight. First of all, I'd like to ask you, maybe I'll start off with the opposition representative here. We're talking about economic reforms today. We're talking about the IMF close to $3 billion of a bailout package that has been approved to Sri Lanka, the first tranche released, and Sri Lanka is gearing up government authorities to face the next review, and by 3rd April, parliamentarians, members of the House, must approve the IMF bill, or rather the IMF agreement with ahead of the creditors' restructuring process. So what is the stance of the NPP today, together with the sentiment of the larger opposition?
Well, the IMF trajectory started last year when the central bank decided that we were defaulting, and that set us on this path which required a third-party intervention, and that's how we have got to this position. Now, the fact of the matter is that although the opposition as a whole has been asking the government to table the agreement that they have with the IMF, this has still not been tabled in Parliament, so we are still basing our intervention on available, the information that's available in the public domain. So the point is this, the point is that we are in a deep economic crisis. Our economy is stagnant. We are bankrupt, we are defaulted, we are in debt both in rupees and in dollars. So these are the crises that have to be addressed. Now, what is the government proposing to do in terms of the economic revival? The IMF is providing, is coming in as a third party for the restructuring process. Now, that doesn't mean that the restructuring is automatic or a given. The government still has to negotiate with the bilateral creditors, as well as with the creditors from whom we have obtained ISBs, international sovereign bonds, in order to come up with a restructuring plan. Then there are very ambitious targets that have been set within the agreement that the government has reached with the IMF in terms of growth, in terms of balancing, of reducing the deficit, of reducing government expenditure, all of these things, which then will have different impacts on different sections of the community. So all of this needs to be discussed, and the bottom line here is that this government does not have a mandate to implement any of these things. And if you look globally at other examples of IMF intervention, when these interventions don't have political consensus and political support, particularly public support, things can go bad really quickly.
But why would you say there is no public support, especially when so much of welfare measures have been taken? And it looks like the people are now content with the measures taken.
Well, I disagree, because if there are different sections of the community which have been impacted differently. Certain sections of the middle class now have access to things that they were denied, such as gas, electricity, fuel, right? And yes, but if you really look at the broader impact of the economy actually not functioning, of the economy being stagnant, job losses, falling incomes, all of these, cost of living, all of these have not been addressed. Welfare measures per se are not going to address this issue because the welfare measures are targeted to those who are really at the bottom of the pile, as it were, and also those criteria are currently being revised, and that in itself is causing other problems, right? But the impact of the economic crisis has been felt by a much larger group than those who have been defined within that welfare program. The problem is much larger, right? So then what steps are in place for those particular groups to actually deal with the situation, particularly with the funding cuts to things like health, education, rising costs in transport, all of this while real incomes have fallen. There are job losses, and as well as cuts in pay, particularly in the private sector. The small and medium entrepreneurs are losing incomes, but again because people are unable to, the consumption has dried up because again linked to falling income. So all of this means that the impact of this crisis is felt by a much larger group than those who are going to be dealt with through the welfare measures that are being proposed, even if those welfare measures were sufficient to deal with the impact of this economic crisis on the real lives of people.
I'd like to turn to State Minister of Tourism, Diana Gamage. Of course, before we talk about tourism and measures being taken to revive the sector, I'd like you to take a cue from Dr. Harini Amarasuriya's claims of although welfare seems to be given, there is so much more that the government needs to be done. Do you share similar sentiment that there is room to improve, or do you have a different comment here?
Well, actually, there are a few things I would not agree to Dr. Harini's, because at the moment, I mean, we have gone through, as we all know, we have been through, we are still going through a huge economical crisis. And also, I wouldn't say the country is now, after the IMF, we cannot declare us as bankrupt at the moment now, because we were defaulted and we were bankrupt, but that is why the IMF was, they came in for the bailout. And you see, the thing is, what's happened here is, we are talking about, a few things that are in particular only. But if you take it as a whole, looking at last year's situation, and when we look at it within the last 8 months, the development in the country, the facilities and the welfare part of it, and also the facilities that has been given for the last 8 months, and now we know the gas has been reduced, the petrol has been reduced. That was obviously due to the IMF coming in for the bailout, and we are getting more. This gives a green light actually for investors to come into the country. This is exactly what we wanted happening. So at the moment, there are people who are really interested in investing in Sri Lanka right now and coming in for investments. Now, when it comes to welfare and things, people have to understand, Sri Lanka is not the only country who's going through this. See, the thing is that we are only looking at it from one part of it. The whole world went through this crisis. And right now, at the moment, even countries like UK are still going through it. I was there recently, and if you look at it, they're also having strikes. The tubes were strike. The nurses, the doctors, they were on strike. So we are having these issues everywhere in the world. It's not only Sri Lanka. But looking at, when we compare, looking at it, President Ranil Wickremesinghe has taken quite a few steps forward and brought things, at least trying to bring things back to normal.
But would you agree that this crisis, yes, we see a trickle-down effect of supply chain challenges because of the war in Ukraine and prolonged COVID impact on countries. But would you agree that this crisis was made by governments that followed, and by authorities and by parliamentarians as you all?
See, this is the problem. This has been going on for quite a while. It has been going on, I would say, for years, because bad decisions, bad management when it comes to economy, there's no national policy in Sri Lanka, which is an absolute must. For any country in the world, there has to be a national policy when it comes to economy, when it comes to national issues. Everything has to be, there should be national policies. And that is something we have to start to implement, at least now. What has happened through this crisis should be taken as a lesson. We cannot go back to normal, because normal was not right. If we go back to normal, we haven't learned the lesson from what has happened. So we have to make sure that we do better than normal. So we, at this present moment, that is exactly what we are trying to do. So if we are looking at what has happened with bad management, 2019, the tax was cut down for no necessary reason. There was no reason to do that. That was a very bad decision that was made. We have to agree, if anybody likes it or not. It was a bad decision. And hence we lost so much with this tax cut in 2019. So these are bad management, and for the last so many years, this has been, accumulating, this bomb. It was like a time bomb. It was bound to happen. So, and the COVID didn't help, obviously. Then came the Ukraine-Russian war, which really made matters worse, because Sri Lanka was relying on a lot of things from, obviously, Russia. We had the gas, we had the fuel, and also our export, especially tea. When it comes to tea, we were exporting to Russia. So these type of things really had an impact on this economical crisis. So right now, yes, the war is still on. We're still having to face that part. But things have happened, and if we keep on going back and talking about the reasons, looking for the reasons, why it happened, and how it happened, or who's to be blamed for it, yes, like you said, I would say there are lots of politicians have to be blamed for it as well. The behaviors of the politicians. We can see it now as well. I am a very independent thinker.
I'd like to know, who's your party leader now?
Well, I have my own party, which is the SJB. I'm a member of that party, and I have actually supported the government through the 20th Amendment when I voted for the 20th Amendment. So I just gave my support because we wanted to change this. Like you saw, the past year we had this Aragalia. So what is the Aragalia? What are they asking for? What are this generation want is a change, a system change. And that's exactly what should happen, because that's why I said we can't go back to normal. This system change has to happen. So thinking in the way we thought in the past, which still a few politicians are thinking the same way, isn't going to help this country.
So do you think protests carried out now in the name of pressing the government and authorities, the president, to open their eyes to higher taxes and increasing prices of goods is an act of terrorism?
I wouldn't say an act of terrorism if it was a peaceful protest. But if the protesters behave like terrorists, then it will be an act of terrorism. You cannot go out there and protest, and you cannot destroy government, property. And there is rules and regulations in a country, you have to obey them. If a court has given an order that you cannot go to a certain area, and especially some of these people, if you see, they target school time. What are they doing? They are targeting the innocent children, leaving school, which is not the right thing to do. And, trying to destroy the government property, that is not right. You can't do things like that. And also, what I say is you can't expect, now for an instance, even if you're having a baby, it takes 9 months from the date of conceiving. If you're going to keep on pricking a pin in a fetus, what are we trying to do? It takes time, because, if you want a proper full-grown baby, if you want a healthy baby, then you can't be damaging the fetus. And that is exactly where we are today, because we are still trying to develop this. And we have just got the IMF. So we have to be given, the government, obviously there's time, it takes time to do things. You can't expect everything overnight. So I find it all propaganda. Protest at the moment on the street is for no reasons and for propaganda. So what are they asking for? We are little by little, the president, you know, eventually we are going to get to that. We will give them what is necessary. But you know, they have to have some patience.
Would you agree to this, that it needs time for the government's policies to pick up and ensure that these changes trickle down to the everyday lives of people? Because the opposition seems to be coming up with narratives. It was the IMF and now it's about the protesters. So is this valid, as the State Minister says, or do you think, Dr. Amarasuriya, that the opposition is actually doing its part here?
As far as we are concerned, as the NPP, I don't think we expect the economy to be revived miraculously within 24 hours. We have never said anything of the sort. But the problem here is that this is not the first time Sri Lanka has received this kind of assistance from the IMF. This is in fact the 17th time. So we need to look at what happened in the past for these reasons, not just to apportion blame on someone, but to understand the causes of the crisis and the patterns that we seem to be following. Minister Derana Gamage spoke about the fact that we are not the only country facing this kind of crisis. She's correct. Then there is something also in the economic system that we have been following, economic policies that we have been following for the past several decades, which give rise to these kinds of crises regularly. Now, our problem with what is happening currently is the fact that we are going down the same path without necessarily understanding correctly the causes that led to this crisis in the first place, as well as the fact that things are changing rapidly now and we can no longer rely on those old models to deliver the kinds of economic benefits that people are expecting, right? So what happened in the past, if you put it very simply, we've obtained loan, we've defaulted on loans, we've developed huge deficits in our budgets, and our economy is very precarious, it's very unstable, it's very prone to crisis, as was evident when there was COVID and the whole system basically collapsed, right? So you cannot have that kind of model anymore. That is what all the evidence is showing, that is what all the experience around us is saying. This needs a radical shift, not just in terms of a change of power, but in terms of what we do. And we don't see this government coming up with any specific strategies to actually get us out of this crisis, to revive the economy in any way, other than following that same tired old model that has been so discredited. You talked about trickle down. That trickle down model has been there's evidence to show that trickle down model does not work. It does not work.
How so?
The trickle, because of the evidence that there's increasing disparities in the economy. There are increasingly people who are in very unstable, very precarious jobs. Livelihoods have fundamentally failed. There's a lot of insecurity in people's lives. That's part of the crisis. The expectation that there's going to be a trickle down to those sections of the community, because that's how the economy functions, that's been disproved all over the world. I mean, there's been economic growth, even in some of the most capitalist of countries, economic growth and huge disparities in living standards, in income. This is within the country as well as between countries. So addressing those disparities, addressing those inequalities, addressing the precarity of people's lives and circumstances has to be a key concern, a key focus of the recovery that we are planning. And if we go down the same path, right, which is just looking at the macroeconomic indicators and imagining that somehow that will take care of the lives of people, that's a big mistake. That's what happened in the past, and that's not going to happen again.
Taken now? Are you saying that corrective measures are not taken now to address the fundamental, the crisis factors in the economy?
Absolutely what I'm saying. Because one of the key factors was the contraction in the economy and the fact that our production has really come down. Our portion in the global market has reduced. So we really need to invest in areas that will enable people to engage in industries, in whatever sectors that can generate enough income for the country as a whole, right? So we cannot continue to rely on migrant labor, purely on expanding the service sector, because those are very contingent on lots of other factors. And circumstances can make those sectors become very weak, as we saw when something like COVID happened. Tourism collapsed. Migrant labor was hit badly. The service sector was badly affected, right? So we need other sources, other sectors that can also generate enough income, generate livelihood, generate economy, generate employment opportunities. We need to have food security. We need to ensure that basic things like health, education, and transport remain constant and remain reliable, right? So those are the measures that we also need to think about. There's plenty of evidence from the past to show that this model that has been followed, A, the trickle down does not happen, B, that there's lots of inequality and lots of disparities in income and in livelihoods and in the living conditions of people, and those have to be addressed specifically.
Before we move on to a short break, I'd also like to find out how you would address the current issue of protests and what your stance is, especially when the economy is trying to pick up from where it is, and now we see essential services going into protests. At the same time, yes, there should be freedom of expression, there should be people's right to dissent. But how would you address this if you were in power, especially when everyday lives are disrupted as a result?
Well, if we were in power, if the NPP was in power, the NPP would have been elected to power on a platform which people vote on and agree on. That's the only way we would be in power. Right? What is happening right now is that the protests are also happening because these measures that are being implemented without people's consent. This government, when it came to power, when it won, when it received a huge mandate, was elected on a completely different manifesto to what it is implementing now. Right? And the measures that are being taken now are being imposed on people with no consultation, no ability for people to express themselves, right? People have been asking for system change in the last 1.5 to 2 years, right? And they've been denied an election, which is a democratic mode of expressing their will, and they're not allowed to protest either. I mean, I have been part of protests where we've been tear gassed and water cannon. There was no destroying of any public building, state building, any building. People are on the streets expressing themselves and being water cannoned and tear gas.
Would you agree that there is no public consent to the government's policy now?
Won't agree on that, because end of the day, you see, if we are, as a government, going to ask every individual in a country, which is 22 million, for their consent of every little thing, then we don't need a government. We as a parliament are not necessary. The government is not necessary. That is why the politicians, the parliamentary system is made, is to take decisions that is right for the country. So if we are going to talk to each and every individual who walks on the street with a board in their hand, then this country isn't going to go anywhere. So that I do not agree. We have to do the right thing for the country. You see, people are always going to protest. There's somebody unhappy all the time. So if you have to make everyone happy, then you're not going to be able to carry on. So we have to make the right decisions for the country and for the 22 million in the country, not for 1 million, not for 500,000 who would get onto the streets. So because every day we will see something or the other. They're not happy about something or the other. So as we can see it now, you can protest, you obviously have the right. It's the right of the people to, to protest, to go against whatever they don't like. They can, that is freedom. That is the democracy. But that doesn't mean you have to get onto the street for everything that you're not happy. You see, this is exactly what's taking place in Sri Lanka. It's become a joke, it's become a trend. Now, this protesting has become a trend. It's a joke now. I mean, the whole world is watching it. And now they want to know, now what else do they want? Because this is the questions we've been asked when we travel.
May I intervene?
So,
I really can't agree with that, because I think that within a democracy, there's representative democracy. We practice representative democracy. And when we say we are representatives of the people, then we are elected on a particular mandate, right? Now, that is why there are things like in many constitutions where people have the right to recall their representatives, or people have referendums, so that people can, especially when there are serious reforms being imposed, that people can participate in that decision making. That is what democracy is. Elections are a fundamental part of that process also. Now, currently in Sri Lanka, we don't have local government level representatives. We don't have provincial council representatives. There has been a aragale in this country demanding that all 225 of us should change, calling for elections, right? Elections have not happened.
But those who were elected, the 225,
were elected on a different mandate, were elected with Gotabaya Rajapaksa as president, as Mahinda Rajapaksa as prime minister. Or if you read the mandate on which they were elected, it's drastically different to the mandate that is being implemented now. Nobody voted for Ranil Wickremesinghe to be president or for Dinesh Gunawardena to be prime minister.
But all this happened based on the constitution within a parliamentary system. Would you not agree to that?
It happened within the constitution, but the constitution doesn't give them the right to also postpone elections. Then how, if you are talking about respect to the constitution and the law, the constitution says that the local government election should have happened on the 9th of March. So we can't cherry pick which aspects of the constitution we want to respect and which we don't. The constitution also says freedom of assembly and the right to protest, the right to express yourself. So we can't say that under these conditions we will respect this aspect of the constitution, under these conditions we don't. Those are not decisions that can be made by the president or the prime minister or any one of us. If we say that the constitution is what is holy and which should be represented, you can't cherry pick which clauses of the constitution you want to respect when it's convenient or not convenient.
Is the government waiting for the right time to have local government elections so your welfare program works?
When it comes to the constitution also does not give the people of this country or anyone for their houses to be burnt down, to be murdered on the street by the public, the representatives of the people, because, end of the day, it is the people who have elected these people, the 225. They didn't come in, in any other way, but the people have elected them into this constitution and into this parliament and to carry out the constitutional, their duties. What I would say about the LG polls, now, in a normal situation, to have the election is fine, but we are not in a normal situation anymore. Sri Lanka, it is an exceptional situation today because Sri Lanka has never been bankrupt before. We may have gone to the IMF 16 times before, but that doesn't mean we were bankrupt. But this time, Sri Lanka has declared bankruptcy. That's why we had to go to the IMF for the 17th time. But in exceptional circumstances, now, I do not agree with Dr. Harini, for these few things is because LG, the local government, there were 8,700 odd working in the past too. We would have elected 8,711 out of all those candidates into office. Now the public, the people of this country has to fork out to pay this 8,711. And that, if you look at it, is 2.61 billion rupees per annum in a situation like this. And there was no money in the country. When the country is in a bankrupt situation, we can't pay our loans, we can't give the people of the country, you know, what they need, the facilities. You know, are we going to employ another 8,711 into this? So all these years we have had all these people in local governments. What has happened?
But still,
where is the
elections
change?
are necessary. But elections
are necessary. I am with that. It is a democratic right, and people do have the right to elect who they want, and they have to have that right for elections. I am not disagreeing at all with that. But what I'm saying, with this right, this current situation, which is an exceptional situation, hence we had to, you know, it cannot go to that situation at the moment. So we have postponed it. I'm sure we will have the polls in the future, the LG polls.
It's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana. We'll return to speak on the policy changes that the government has taken and how the Sri Lankan economy can move ahead into a manufacturing-led growth economy. After this break. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park, and we're in conversation with female representatives of Parliament, Dr Harini Amarasuriya and State Minister Derana Gamage, talking about the Sri Lankan economy and how we can move ahead together with the opposition's role and the government's policy changes brought ahead. Dr Harini Amarasuriya, I'd like to talk about Sri Lanka's way out of this economic crisis. A key measure that President Ranil Wickremesinghe has implemented is reviving state-owned enterprises. But the NPP-led JVP or JVP-led NPP and your party doesn't seem to agree with the revival of state-owned assets that have proven to be making losses and a burden to the Sri Lankan economy decades after decades.
If I may, I just want to touch on one thing that my colleague, Minister Derana Gamage, has touched on in her last paper, where she talked about the exceptional situation. I think that's where we have to be also very careful about who decides on these states of exception, right? And when we decide, when we know one of us has a God-given right to declare anything a state of exception. Economic crisis was a state of exception, fair enough. So was the Aragalaya, where people demanded change, right? So we have to take all of that into account when we think about what measures need to be taken and how to uphold democracy. You can't, again, one or a few people can't decide on those states of exception. I think that's a very dangerous path to go on and a very dangerous precedent to set if suddenly we decide at this moment elections cannot be held. That's why it's constitutionally mandated. Okay. Your question about state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises have to be revived. You use the word revived. What is happening now is not revival. The state be divesting itself of not loss-making enterprises, but also profit-making enterprises, right? The president recently declared that the state should not own any enterprises. Even if you go by his own ideology of you know, the capitalist neoliberal economy, many countries which follow that economic path, there are many states which own enterprises, right? These are not just left-wing governments or left-wing countries which own state have enterprises. These are capitalist right-wing governments also, right? So we agree, NPP has always said that loss-making state enterprises have to be restructured, have to be revived.
But does that also mean they could be privatized? Are you in agreement with that?
Well, that's an assessment that has to be made on the basis of each institution that is to be considered. We don't, I think it's a mistake and this narrative that privatization automatically leads to revival is incorrect, right? Privatization can also be corrupt, can also lead to loss, right? As much as government-led. So it is not whether it's government-owned or privately owned that leads to loss making.
But what would be the sustainable solution that you
the
and your party?
Solution is to make an assessment of all of these institutions and decide which ones can be left to the private sector to best operate, and which the government needs to also have some control over. So for us, we think certainly things like the energy sector and the financial sector, the government needs to play a role, because these are not simply things that can be regulated purely on market logic. There are also services. They are also linked to things like national security. So if the state has no control over any of these sectors, it can lead to it can lead to lots of crises and lots of problems which affect people in general, right? This is why there's a state to intervene. Also, the other issue is that if the move is towards privatization, say we follow that model, right? Then there need to be really good regulatory mechanisms. Now what is happening, you're seeing a clash between the regulatory body and the government, where when the regulatory body gives recommendations that seem to be not in line with the government thinking, the government then crushes the regulatory body. Whether it's a regulatory body like the Public Utilities Commission, or whether it's independent commissions, if those bodies do not toe the government line, then the government shuts those down, right? Or does not follow those recommendations. So that's also really dangerous. I mean, I think there are so many examples currently from around the world about the need for regulatory mechanisms, proper regulatory mechanisms, if privatization is the path that is to be followed. Right? And the lack of those regulatory mechanisms have resulted in many crises all over the world. We saw what happened in 2008 in the US. Since then, there have been huge moves. Even bodies like the IMF and the World Bank are talking about stronger regulatory mechanisms.
Minister Gamage, do you agree that these regulatory measures are needed? And has the government taken any steps towards this? We know that there are committees overseeing the restructuring process, but how much of progress have you made in this regard?
Well, actually, Sri Lanka, the government-owned institutions, we have 13 running at huge losses at the moment, and that's going up over 300 billion. Running losses. So yes, I agree with the regularity, all those has to be done. It's a must. But Sri Lanka, all throughout, for the last 75 years of our independence, people have got used to the system of, they are in their comfort zone when it comes to state-owned institutions. They don't want to get out of that comfort zone. And hence, we have to face situations like huge losses. There is no competition. You see, going into privatization, making these private, going into PPPs will give more, opportunities to get it into the right path. Because people, you see, when it comes to these unions, how they behave. For every little thing, like you said, they are on the streets. They are like, we are saying, as you can see, they are protesting. Now, this is because they don't want to come out of that comfort zone. So this isn't helping the economy of Sri Lanka. If we are running into, like for instance, Sri Lankan Airlines is running into billions of loss. So isn't that supposed to be going into some sort of a privatization? Not Sri Lanka.
But what of these profit-making, those entities that are...
I agree with Dr. Harini, where we have to have an assessment of which ones are actually making profit and true profit, not for the sake of on a piece of paper, true profit. But then there are ones that really needs to go on a PPP basis, because we have to have that. We need it in a country, because even if you take other countries, if you take UK, the Royal Mail is on a privatized, British telecom is on a privatized. And that's how they give you the proper service comes out as well, because there's a competition in between. So we need to open up. We need to open up this market. We need that change in the country. As I said, we cannot go back to the normal situation. If we need to see a change, if we need to see a different, we have to do something different. Doing the same thing isn't going to make any difference, because it's going to go back to the same situation. So if we can see that these are the places that Sri Lanka has really lost on these are the areas that we really need to develop, then that is exactly what we should be doing. So PPPs are absolutely necessary, like opening up the market, bringing in more competitors into the country. These are a must. It has to happen. Otherwise, we are not going a way forward. We're going to be in the same stale situation, stagnating in the same place. And that cannot happen. So some things has to be changed in the country. But yes, under those regulatory systems, rules and regulations, all have to be implemented. There's no doubt about that. And that is being done at the moment. It is happening. There's progress taking, there are assessments being made at the moment with the state-owned institutions.
I know you have a comment to make here, but I'd like to also add another question to that. You spoke about an export economy and why and how the government has taking measures to propel that economy we are looking at. So what do you propose we do in the immediate next, maybe short to mid-term, as we look at growth momentum through an export-led economy? We are in the final phase of the program, so I'd like to ask all these questions.
Yeah, very quickly, I just want to come in on it. I mean, imagining that privatization will create competitiveness is also a bit of a, it's a bit of a not quite correct, because you look at the egg industry. Egg industry is, I think, a classic example. Egg industry is privatized, is private. There's no state involvement in it. It hasn't led to the reduction of price of eggs or the availability of eggs, right? I mean, that sector is in a crisis. Look at the rice mills. That's privatized, right? There's no state involvement. We haven't been able to control the price of rice nor the supply of rice, despite it being a completely private sector. So it is not just about privatization that will create competition and ensure that there's a fair deal for consumers. There's a lot of other stuff that needs to happen. So this idea, this narrative that privatization in and of itself will fix everything is a very dangerous narrative to have. Now about an export and manufacturing, I mean, we need to invest in areas where we can be competitive. That requires some kind of a long-term policy of identifying those sectors, of developing the human capacity to fill those sectors, of ensuring that we have the right the diplomatic relations to link our markets, to bring in the investment for those particular sectors, ensuring a corruption-free regulatory environment where these enterprises can be innovative and can function properly. All of these things need to happen. So just opening up the market is not going to bring in foreign direct investment unless you identify sectors, you set in place the systems that will bring in the kinds of investments that are needed, and also looking at the raw material that is required for developing those sectors, right? So there has to be there has to be a systematic assessment of the areas and sectors in which we want to develop in order to drive a export-led economy. Look at like the human resource needs, the investment needs, the intellectual needs that are required, the scientific technological investments necessary, the ways in which we create the links in the international market and facilitate those links between the investor, the manufacturer, the industry, and the market. All of those things have to be in place, right? So that requires some kind of strategy, that requires mid to long-term policy and consistent policy. We've not had consistent policy on any of these areas for decades.
That's something we've been touching on Hyde Park throughout. I'd also like to talk about the tourism industry. As State Minister, something we see here is that that significant concrete measures have not been taken in the tourism industry as well to ensure a growth that we envisage as much as we like to. Yes, the tourism has opened up. We have more tourists coming into the country. It looks lucrative. But in order to achieve the sustainability we're talking about, regardless of what challenges we have, what measures do you propose? And are there challenges in working with the authorities that you have to work with?
Absolutely, yes. There are huge challenges that I have to face myself. And like we've seen the development of tourism within the last few months, there has been a huge increase actually. Looking at it from 2022, there's been nearly a 4% increase these few months. And even the revenue that has come in, it's been like over 300 million for the few months that, you know, for the start of these few months. And we have had over 350,000 tourists already who have visited, compared to the year before, which was 700,000 only for 2022. So for the last few months, being 300 and, you know, over 50,000, we are planning to have at least, you know, I don't know, my target is at least 1.5 million by end of this year. But saying that, yes, there are lots of things to be done within the country when it comes to tourism. To be honest, speaking very openly and very radically and very honestly, I find Sri Lankan tourism hasn't been promoted the way it should. And the facilities are not there. If we go out, I mean, we can ask tourists to come into this country, but what are the facilities we provide for them? That's a question. Wherever I have visited, I have found that there's lots of lack of facilities for the prices we are charging, which needs to be absolutely corrected. And these are the things that I am having to face, like I said, challenges, because obviously...
But who is responsible to rectifying these? Who can do it? You're State Minister of Tourism. You're also part of
I am, but there is a higher, you know, a cabinet minister above me. And the cabinet minister, the secretaries, the workforce comes under him, who takes all the decisions. So when it has to be, you know, taking decisions, I think they have to be able to work together and try to understand what we're trying to say. Like I said, people are in a comfort zone. They're in a box, they're in a frame, and they don't want to move out of this frame. They don't want to get out of this box. So they are working on within this frame, and it doesn't work for Sri Lanka tourism anymore. The world is changing, Sri Lanka has changed, and this is the change that I'm looking to make, because we need to provide the facilities. Like for an instance, what I've been talking about in the past about nightlife. If you walk out there at 10:30 in the night, it is just absolutely dark. There's no place that you can get a drink, food, nothing, everything is shut. If you go to a 5-star hotel, 11 o'clock they close the bar. You see, the tourists coming into the country, they're looking to enjoy themselves. That's why they spend so much money and come in here. So if we are going to shut, and if we are not going to open up, where we can get the revenue, what we can get the money in, the spending, we're not going to make anything. We're going to be stuck in the same place. So this is exactly what my, fight is for, is that we really need to change this system. Mm-hmm. We need to make sure that we give what is required and what they request, we have to provide.
I think that's one point where both parliamentarians would agree upon a system change. And before we wrap up, this is something I'd like to talk about tourism going forward too. With Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, of course, I did have a one-on-one Hyde Park. But again, before we wrap up, I'm really happy that I've had the chance to speak to two women representatives who are educated and at the same time proactive in Parliament. But how do we look at improving female representation? Women like you who can tell the men out there that they are actually making wrong decisions and ensure that women lead tomorrow's growth of the economy.
Would you like both of us to answer that? At the
Both
same
of you,
time?
of course.
Right. Let me say something to you. I was in the UK with 56 countries in the Commonwealth just a few weeks ago. And there's one thing in common in the world, and that's the women. The women are having to face the same issues everywhere in the world. But one thing also I found out is that it's not the men who are stopping the women. It is the women who are stopping the women. It is the women themselves who are having problems with women coming forward. So this issue we have to address with the women first of any country. This is something that happened, I mean, you know, when I went to UK as well. It's the same issue, the same problem. It is not the men. The men come after. So we have to change it. We need more women representatives in the parliament. We need to increase, because Sri Lanka, compared to all other countries who I met, Sri Lanka is the lowest representation in parliament, 5%. So that's not good enough. So we have to start to change it from, I think, ourselves.
Right, Harini, I think we have just a minute.
Well, lots of changes are necessary, and a cultural change is necessary. We need to get out of this sort of very masculine culture that exists in politics, and have a more supportive, less violent, less aggressive political culture that enables women. And I think you can't also discount the fact that women are carrying a lot of social reproductive responsibilities which limit what they can do outside of that role, especially women of less privileged circumstances who can't outsource their social reproductive responsibilities. Those are real challenges that women face. So, I mean, I think a great example of how you do this is the 25% quota that we saw in the local government bodies. First, there was a lot of noise about how there were not enough good quality women coming up. But I think in the second time round, at least for us at the NPP, we've found really good candidates, right? So I think quotas don't fix the problem, but quotas are, when we are in the kind of abysmal situation that we are in, quota is also one way to go forward. But I think it's much more a cultural change that is required, which is more supportive of a more democratic, more representative parliamentary political system.
And I want to add to that. I have to say in Sri Lanka, there are very strong women, educated, strong characters who would like to come forward. But like Dr. Harini said, this cultural system, which obviously, I don't know, sometimes I think she has to face. I have faced it all throughout, personally. So that system has to be changed. And that's when I think we can get the cream of this country. There are so many out there.
Certainly not
so
a lack of competence.
There's no lack of women out there who are strong.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for your courage in Parliament, for being a voice for the voiceless, for the people, regardless of your political affiliations. And thank you for making the time to be here at Hyde Park.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We had with us Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, representing the National People's Power, and State Minister of Tourism, Diana Gamage, joining us, representing the government tonight at Hyde Park to talk about the opposition's role as well as the government's policy making ahead in achieving a sustainable economic growth path for the Sri Lankan economy. We'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another discussion at Hyde Park. Good night.